In a forgotten village nestled deep within the folds of a mountainous region where even the sunrise seemed shy to touch the earth, a boy named Xavian was born into silence. Not the silence of nature nor the peaceful silence of sleep, but the haunting silence of isolation. Xavian didn't speak not a word since birth, not because he couldn't, but because life had shown him early on that his voice had no place in a world that refused to hear the unheard. His father, a laborer who worked in the mines, came home every night with coal on his skin and fury in his breath. His mother, quiet and bruised by fate, washed clothes in the village stream and raised her 3 children like wilted flowers that somehow refused to stop growing. Xavian was the youngest and the most invisible. While the other boys played cricket in dusty fields and shouted dreams into the wind, Xavian sat alone near the rocks watching ants build their tiny empires, tracing his fingers through dirt, sketching shapes only he could understand. The village labeled him mute, slow, or simply the useless one. But no one saw the fire smoldering behind those observant eyes, a storm silently preparing to rise. Every morning before dawn, Xavian would walk nearly 5 kilometers barefoot to a school that existed more on paper than in reality. Broken benches, missing windows, teachers who came only for salaries, yet Xavian sat there daily silently soaking in every word, every formula, every story. While others chatted, he listened. While others mocked him, he memorized the math problems on the cracked blackboard. At home, when the world slept, Xavian would light a kerosene lamp and read discarded books his elder sister brought from town, science manuals, poetry, even old English novels he couldn't yet understand but whose rhythm he felt deep within. He didn't need a voice. His mind had already started shouting. But life wasn't kind. One winter night when Xavian was just 10, his father didn't return from the mines. A tunnel had collapsed, crushing half the workers and burying dreams with bones. That night his mother didn't cry, she sat still, staring at the flickering lantern, her hands gripping a shawl like it was her last thread to reality. Xavian didn't cry either, he simply picked up the torn notebook he had hidden beneath his cot and wrote. Wrote like his hands were speaking the words his mouth never could. From that day forward he wrote every night, ideas, questions, inventions, stories, dreams. A notebook became 2, then 5, soon he had a stack of them, all filled with quiet brilliance. Years passed, the village grew older, but Xavian didn't change. Still quiet, still walking alone, still writing. He was now 15, taller, leaner, and with eyes that looked like they carried galaxies. One day a government inspector visited the school, an event rarer than rainfall in that dry region. The principal, eager to impress, asked the top students to show their work. Xavian sat in the back, uninvited but watching. When no student could solve a physics problem on the board, Xavian raised his hand for the first time in his life. The room went silent, mocking, skeptical. But when he walked to the board, chalk trembling in his fingers, and solved the equation step by step flawlessly, the inspector stood speechless. That moment changed everything. The inspector, stunned by his silent genius, visited his home the next day, saw the pile of handwritten notes, drawings of machines Xavian had imagined, essays about stars and psychology, and immediately contacted the district office. Within weeks, Xavian was offered a scholarship to a prestigious science school in the city. His mother, still fragile but proud, held his face and whispered, "Go show them what silence can create." It was the first time Xavian cried. City life was chaos. Noise, judgment, pressure, a world that moved too fast for a boy raised in stillness. Students mocked his village clothes, his silence, his awkward ways. But Xavian didn't care. He devoured books in the library like a starving man, asked questions with his notebook instead of his voice, and stunned professors with his inventions. At 17, he built a solar-powered water purifier using discarded parts. At 18, he submitted a paper on silent intelligence, the power of observant minds, to an international journal, and it went viral. Suddenly, Xavian wasn't invisible. He was being called a silent prodigy, a genius who didn't speak but was heard louder than most. He was invited to give a TED Talk. Terrified but determined, he walked on stage with shaking hands, looked at the crowd, and instead of speaking, played a short video, a story of a boy from a nameless village who believed in thought more than words. The screen went dark. And then Xavian spoke his first public words. "I was never mute, the world just never listened." The auditorium erupted, not in applause but in tears. That moment didn't just shock the world, it awakened it. Xavian became a global symbol of inner strength. He launched initiatives for silent learners, introverts, and rural students. He built schools in remote villages, gave TED Talks around the world, even met with world leaders who once couldn't pronounce his name. But Xavian remained humble, still quiet, still thoughtful, still walking barefoot sometimes to remind himself where he came from. Xavian, now known globally as the voice of the voiceless, never allowed success to blind the pain that shaped him. Despite international fame, interviews, research grants, and standing ovations in places his village had never heard of, he He never once forgot the cracked mud walls of his childhood, the sting of walking barefoot on hot stones, or the cold silence of being unseen. At just 21, he had achieved what generations in his village had never dreamed of, but it wasn't enough. Not for him, because deep inside he wasn't chasing success. He was chasing redemption for all the silent children the world ignored. One morning, with no media, no photographers, no security, Xavier returned to the same village that once called him useless. He stepped off a local bus wearing a simple kurta, holding a dusty backpack and an old notebook. The village hadn't changed much, the same broken hand pumps, rusting school gate, and curious eyes watching from behind cracked windows. But something was different. This time, Xavier wasn't invisible. As he walked down the narrow dirt path, whispers spread like wildfire. "Isn't that Xavier, the boy who couldn't speak? Didn't he meet the Prime Minister?" Children who once threw stones now offered water. Elders who once ignored him stood up with trembling respect. And in the crowd stood his mother, older now, her eyes filled with pride and tears that had waited too long. He didn't give speeches that day. He didn't hold a ceremony. Instead, he gathered the village under the banyan tree, the same spot where he once sat alone, and opened his backpack. From it, he pulled models of machines he had designed to help the village: low-cost irrigation systems, solar-powered lights, water filters. But more than machines, he brought blueprints for a new school, one that would be free, one that would welcome every child, mute or loud, poor or privileged. And he named it the School of Silent Genius, a place where curiosity would matter more than confidence, where silence would be heard. Construction began within weeks, with funding from global donors inspired by his story. Xavier himself worked shoulder to shoulder with villagers, lifting bricks, digging soil, not to show off, but to feel every inch of the dream becoming real. Within a year, the school opened, colorful, solar-powered, with libraries bigger than classrooms, teachers trained to understand not just loud answers but quiet brilliance. Children from neighboring villages started enrolling. For the first time, the area had hope, real hope. But Xavier's impact didn't stop there. He started an online movement called Hear the Quiet, encouraging people worldwide to share stories of introverts, outcasts, and hidden talents. Stories flooded in of a deaf girl who became a painter, a janitor who invented a recycling system, a shy orphan who memorized entire books. Xavier curated these stories into a book called The World Behind the Noise, a bestseller translated into 19 languages. He refused all personal profits, donating everything to rural education. Fame kept knocking. Netflix wanted a biopic. Hollywood offered a script, but Xavier kept rejecting them all. "If the story needs me," he said once in an interview, "it's not ready. When the world is ready to listen without sound, then they'll understand." Then came the most emotional day of his life, the school's first graduation ceremony. He stood on stage looking at a sea of young faces, many of whom, like him, had once been labeled slow, mute, or nothing. A young girl in the front row, missing a hand but top of her class, handed him a flower and whispered, "You showed me I was enough." He didn't respond with words. He simply held her hand and smiled, a moment that was captured in a photo that would go viral for years. But fate wasn't done testing Xavier. At 25, he was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that threatened his memory. Slowly, he began forgetting faces, names, and even his own childhood sketches. Doctors recommended rest, isolation, and long treatment. But Xavier, even facing decline, chose to fight. He recorded videos, wrote instructions, and appointed a team of silent learners, his students, to carry on the work. He said, "Even if I forget who I am, the world will remember the message." And they did. 3 years later, Xavier passed away peacefully, sitting under the same banyan tree where his story began, a notebook in his hand, and a single line scribbled in his fatting handwriting. "Silence is not the way."